Can a single plate of pasta change the fate of a person? The faint clinking of a knife and spoon against a white porcelain plate echoed sharply in the elegant but sparsely populated branch number 17 of Gusto Fresco. Ethan Ward sat quietly in a shadowed corner, his worn coat and messy hair making him look no different from an unknown food blogger wandering from place to place in search of a decent meal. The name Connor Blake he used today was the perfect disguise, but behind it were the eyes of the man who had built this culinary empire with pride and relentless dedication. He twirled a forkful of linguine and tasted it, his lips pressed together the moment the first bite hit his tongue. The noodles were soft to the point of falling apart, lacking the springy texture of the handcrafted pasta that had once made Gusto Fresco famous. The sauce was watery, bland, leaving a strange metallic aftertaste enough for anyone with a trained palate to know something was terribly wrong. Ethan turned slightly, discreetly spitting the noodles into his napkin with a calm motion that looked no different from wiping his mouth. There was no visible anger on his face, only a cold, quiet disappointment churning beneath his composed exterior. The branch director, Martin Hale, stood a few steps away, notebook in hand, his stiff smile strained. "Does the dish suit your taste, sir?" Martin's tone was awkward, clearly uninterested in the real answer, more concerned with playing the part of a polite manager. Ethan glanced down at the plate, his gaze indifferent, though inside him a restrained anger burned. "It's fine," he replied flatly, his deep voice as sharp and thin as a blade. "I'm just taking a few small notes." Martin exhaled in relief, his forced smile still fixed on his face, oblivious to the fact that the empty nod he received was the worst sign he could get. Ethan nudged the fork slightly, watching the clumped linguine lying under the pale red sauce, and his chest tightened. This was once the dish that made Gusto Fresco's name, the dish that had customers waiting in long lines under the rain just for a single plate. Now the noodles sat lifeless, barely half-eaten. He put the fork down, pulling his laptop closer, his eyes darkening as the numbers flashed on the screen. Branch 17's revenue had dropped by 25% in just 3 months, with refund requests rising nearly 50%. The downward sloping graph looked like a deep scar, threatening to sink the pride he had spent nearly a decade building. Loyal customers had vanished, and social media was flooded with repeated complaints. Bland. Not like it used to be. What happened to Gusto Fresco? Ethan clenched his fists, staring at the numbers like they were accusations. This wasn't just a bad quarter. This was a warning, a death knell for the brand if he didn't act fast. Memories hit him like a punch to the chest. He saw himself 8 years ago, a 23-year-old young man, sleeves rolled up, hair drenched in sweat in a cramped kitchen. He remembered the smell of the first pot of sauce simmering, the fragrance of ripe tomatoes, fresh basil, and the finest olive oil filling the air, making the first picky customer cry because it reminded them of a family meal in Naples. He had once known exactly how many minutes to boil pasta, when to add each pinch of salt, staying up countless nights perfecting the ratios of his ingredients. But now, those rich, fragrant sauces had been replaced by convenient industrial batches, and the kitchen that once brimmed with passion was nothing more than a soulless machine. Ethan took a deep breath, bitterness catching in his throat. He sat still for a long moment, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the cold plate of pasta. Someone ruined everything, he thought, his inner voice cutting through his pride like a knife. And if I don't find the truth myself, Gusto Fresco will be nothing but a name. His eyes glinted with the hardened resolve no one had seen in him for years, the look of the man who had built this empire with nothing but his own 2 hands. Leaning back in his chair slightly, he whispered under his breath, barely audible, "Someone is killing my life's work, but I won't let it happen." The mid-range hotel room was bathed in dim yellow light, the silence pressing like a weight on the air. Ethan Ward sat alone at the table, his hand gripping a cold cup of coffee, his eyes fixed on an old photograph in front of him. In the picture, a young man with a bright smile stood in a tiny kitchen, holding a pot of rich red sauce, his messy hair and tired face marked by exhaustion, but his eyes shone with pride. That was Ethan 8 years ago, the young man who stirred every pot himself, who smelled every sprig of basil to make sure everything was perfect. Back then, he knew the exact simmering time of every sauce, the precise seconds to boil pasta, so much so that he could tell doneness with his eyes closed, just by the sound of bubbles rolling in the pot. But all of that had been buried under piles of financial reports, dull meetings, and soulless cost-cutting decisions. He picked up the photograph, staring at the youthful face for a long time. Those younger eyes seemed to look back at him, asking, "Have you forgotten why you started, Ethan? Have you forgotten that this food once saved desperate people with nothing but a smile?" His throat tightened. He slammed the photo down on the table, the dull thud echoing in the quiet room, and suddenly his gaze changed. It was no longer the weary stare of a CEO crushed by numbers. It was sharp, hard, the same fire he once had as a young man standing in front of his very first stove. Ethan opened his laptop, scrolling through revenue charts again. The plunging lines on the screen felt like deep cuts slashing at his pride. He zoomed in on branch number 17, the place he once called the soul of Gusto Fresco. Sales had dropped by 25%, refund rates had surged by nearly 50%, and loyal customers had almost completely disappeared in just 3 months. A flashing red note on the report read, "Food quality inconsistent. Repeated negative customer feedback." He stared at that line, anger rising like a slow-burning fire. Food quality inconsistent. Ethan let out a cold, bitter laugh. Inconsistent means it's no longer my food. He pushed back his chair and stood, walking to the mirror. In the reflection, he saw a man in an expensive suit, clean-shaven, hair slicked back neatly. All of it felt like a stranger compared to the man in the photo. He yanked off his jacket, tore at his tie, tossing them onto the chair. Rolling up his sleeves, he ran his fingers through his hair, deliberately messing it into a disheveled style. Then he opened the drawer, pulling out a grooming kit. The sound of scissors snipping echoed in the quiet room, strands of neatly combed hair falling to the floor, leaving behind a rough, tousled cut full of grit. Ethan stared at himself in the mirror, a slight smirk tugging at his lips. Connor Blake was ready. On the table, he placed 3 items: a worn-out backpack, an old leather notebook, and a phone with a fake food blog app already set up. He opened the blog and typed the first line. "A journey to rediscover authentic Italian flavors, notes from the places where taste was born." The words glowed on the screen like a vow. Ethan sat back down, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes burning with determination. His deep, gravelly voice filled the quiet room in a low whisper. "They think I'll just sit and watch everything fall apart. They've forgotten how I built this empire with my own hands." He took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. "Fine. I'll be back, but this time, I won't be CEO Ethan Ward. I'll be Connor Blake, a nobody, and I will expose every single person who betrayed the soul of Gusto Fresco." The golden light from the lamp cast across his face, revealing eyes full of fierce determination and something else, a fire that had long been dormant, now burning alive again. The glass door of Gusto Fresco branch number 17 gave a soft ting as Ethan, or rather Connor Blake, stepped inside. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the large windows, reflecting off polished wooden tables and neatly arranged chairs, everything looking as meticulously staged as a theater set. But despite the flawless presentation, Ethan could feel an emptiness hanging in the air. There were no bursts of laughter, no lively clinking of cutlery, only the occasional murmur of customers, their eyes cast downward at their plates with quiet reluctance. He chose a table near the corner by the window, a spot that gave him a clear view of the entire dining area. From here, he observed everything with the sharp focus of a hawk circling its prey. Servers passed by with practiced smiles, but their eyes were dull and lifeless. At the next table, a young boy pushed his bowl of pasta aside, frowning as he whispered to his mother, "Mom, the sauce tastes strange." bland and a bit sour. The woman gently smoothed his hair, nodded, and called a server to replace the dish. Ethan quietly took out his phone and opened his notes. Customers don't complain loudly, but they stop eating. The silence is the most dangerous sign. Even the smell in the air wasn't what he remembered. Instead of the rich aroma of ripe tomatoes mingled with basil and fragrant olive oil, there was only a faint, uninspired scent, hollow and soulless. Ethan tapped his fingers on the table rhythmically, his eyes scanning toward the open kitchen. And then he saw him. Amid the slightly chaotic movement of the kitchen, a tall man in a black apron moved with precision bordering on perfection. He stood straight as a soldier, squared shoulders, neatly combed hair, no name tag, yet every staff member instinctively stepped aside when he walked past. Ethan narrowed his eyes, the corner of his mouth twitching. This was no ordinary employee. The man approached the prep station, bending slightly to inspect a tray of freshly cooked pasta. Unlike the other chefs who glanced and moved on, he checked it thoroughly. He lifted a single strand of pasta, held it under the light to inspect its sheen, then pinched it between his fingers, gently stretching it to feel its elasticity. A second later, without hesitation, he tossed the entire batch into the trash. The surrounding staff froze momentarily, glancing in shock, but no one dared to question him. He simply gestured for the assistant chef to start another batch. Ethan tilted his phone slightly, catching the man's face in the reflection of the screen, snapping a discreet photo. His eyes gleamed with intrigue as he quickly typed a note. Excessive control, why? A server passed by Ethan's table, smiling politely. Seizing the moment, Ethan asked casually in the offhand tone of a curious food blogger, "Does he always work like that?" The woman paused, glanced quickly toward the kitchen, then lowered her voice. "Mason Grant. Everyone here's afraid of him. He doesn't need to say much. One look and people know exactly what to do. They say he used to be a head chef trained in Italy." Her voice dropped even lower, as if sharing a secret. "But lately, he's been stricter than ever, almost obsessive, like he's hiding something." Ethan gave a small nod of thanks, but his eyes never left Mason. While the rest of the staff moved about sluggishly, Mason worked with a near-obsessive focus. He adjusted the angle of a ladle by a mere few degrees, wiped the rim of a plate until it was spotless, only nodding once he deemed it perfect enough to serve. Leaning back in his chair, Ethan allowed a faint, cold smirk to play at the corner of his lips, his gaze sharp as ice. "What are you hiding, Mason Grant?" He typed another quick note into his phone. "Too perfect, too controlled, like a man trying to fix something or hide it." Ethan's eyes glinted with the thrill of a predator catching its first trace of prey. The night settled slowly over the empty street, the dim yellow streetlights reflecting off the glass walls of Gusto Fresco. Ethan sat in a gray rental car with the lights off, parked behind a row of trees across the street. The clock on the dashboard ticked forward, each click echoing in the silence, broken only by the soft rustling of the wind. He glanced at his wristwatch, 3:48 a.m. The entire restaurant was dark except for a faint strip of light spilling from the back kitchen. His phone, lying on the passenger seat, vibrated softly, triggered by the small hidden camera he had discreetly placed by the back door earlier that afternoon. The kitchen door opened slightly. A figure appeared, moving quickly and with purpose. Mason Grant. He wore a gray hoodie, hood pulled low over half his face, a worn canvas bag slung over his shoulder. His steps weren't cautious or secretive, but confident, like someone who had done this many times before. The door closed, and his shadow disappeared. Ethan leaned forward, switching to his phone's live feed from the camera. Mason placed the bag on the prep counter. The kitchen was empty, no other staff in sight, no sound of machines humming, just the sterile hum of white fluorescent light. Mason pulled out a small digital scale, a weathered leather notebook, and a pen-style thermometer. He unscrewed the lid of a fine powder, spooned it carefully onto the scale, his eyes locked on the digital display. The number blinked before settling exactly at 32.7 grams. Mason nodded slightly, scribbling quickly into the notebook, then moved on to salt, olive oil, and drops of water, each measured with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Ethan's eyes stayed glued to the screen, his pulse quickening. No one cooked at this hour with that level of precision. This wasn't cooking. This was experimentation. Mason tilted a pan, checking the sauce with the thermometer. 91.4 degrees. Another nod, a slight swirl of the pan, then he tasted a single spoonful and immediately made another note. Moments later, Mason plated 6 portions of spaghetti. Each plate looked like a work of art, strands of pasta coiled into perfect nests, the sauce smooth and glossy, a deep, rich red catching the light. Ethan almost forgot to breathe, his gaze fixed on the flawless plates. But what happened next made him freeze. Mason snapped quick photos of each dish from multiple angles, added a few more notes, and without hesitation, dumped every plate into the trash. Not a single bite tasted. He wiped down the counter, sanitized every tool meticulously, then slipped the notebook back into his bag. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his heart racing, a half-smile curling at the corner of his lips. You're not cooking for customers. You're experimenting, but why keep it a secret? What are you chasing, Mason Grant? He tapped a quick note into his phone, murmuring softly in the quiet of the car. Not sabotage obsession, but obsessed with what? The glowing text on the screen shimmered faintly in the darkness like a promise. Ethan looked back toward the kitchen through the glass, where Mason still stood, the harsh white light outlining his face, his eyes focused with an almost chilling intensity. And in that very moment, Ethan knew the secret he was hunting for wouldn't be as simple as a recipe that had been changed. The lazy afternoon sunlight spilled through the wide glass windows of Gusto Fresco. Ethan sat at his usual corner table, playing his familiar role Connor Blake, the anonymous food blogger. In front of him sat a cup of coffee gone cold, but his eyes never left the kitchen in the distance, where Mason Grant stood as still as a statue. Mason worked with a near-obsessive focus, every movement executed with frightening precision. Each time a dish was brought out, he inspected it meticulously, from the color of the sauce to the way the pasta was coiled, as if the smallest imperfection was enough to reject the entire plate. Ethan glanced up as a young server passed by carrying a tray. Offering a polite smile, he asked in a casual tone laced with quiet curiosity, "That guy, Mason, is he always this particular?" The young woman paused, glancing briefly toward Mason before lowering her voice. "He's always been careful, but not like this. He used to leave early, around 8 in the evening, just to make it home in time to read to his daughter before bed. Ellie, she loved the pasta here, especially the old sauce recipe. But lately what?" Ethan leaned in slightly, his tone curious, just as a blogger would sound. The girl looked around cautiously, her voice dropping so low it was almost a whisper meant only for the two of them. "Lately, Mason stays until really late, sometimes almost morning. No one knows why. Ellie is his whole world, but he doesn't even make it home in time for bedtime anymore. There's only one reason Mason would change this much. Something bad must have happened." Ethan nodded in thanks, his gaze returning to Mason. Narrowing his eyes, he studied the man's every movement. Mason maintained a calm, composed exterior, but there was something beneath it, an exhaustion hidden behind the rigid control. At one point, Mason lingered at the counter, his hand unconsciously brushing his left wrist, where a faint mark from a long-worn watch strap was visible, before quickly pulling his sleeve down to cover it. As Mason turned slightly, Ethan caught a fleeting emptiness in his eyes. It wasn't the look of a man proud of his work. It was the look of someone clinging desperately to something fragile, as if everything else in his life had already slipped away. Ethan leaned forward, jotting a quick note in the small notebook hidden inside his backpack. Not for money, not for pride. He's here for something else. Something big enough to sacrifice sleep and the habits that used to mean everything to him. A freshly plated pasta dish was placed on the pass. Mason approached, inspecting it carefully. He leaned in close, scooped a small spoonful of sauce, tilting it under the light as if he were appraising a rare gem. Ethan watched, holding his breath, his chest tight with anticipation. Mason frowned slightly, lowered the spoon, then without hesitation tossed the entire dish into the trash, offering no explanation. That wasn't the reaction of a typical perfectionist chef. That was the reaction of a man at war with himself, burdened by something unseen pressing heavily on his shoulders. Ethan rested his chin on his hand, his eyes glinting sharply. He whispered under his breath, as if speaking only to himself. "What are you trying to fix, Mason? Or rather, who are you trying to save?" In that moment, Ethan knew this secret was bigger than declining revenue reports, more important than Gusto Fresco's reputation, and he would dig until he uncovered every last piece of it. The night rain fell lightly, droplets sliding down the car window, streetlights casting blurry streaks of yellow across the glass. Ethan sat in his car, phone gripped tightly in his hand, eyes locked on the back door of Gusto Fresco. The clock on the dashboard neared 10 p.m. The restaurant had just gone dark. He had guessed Mason would stay late, and that guess was exactly right. The back door opened, and Mason stepped out, wearing a dark gray jacket, carrying a black thermal container, his steps firm but weighed down. Ethan started the car, keeping just enough distance as he followed Mason through empty streets. The tires rolled across wet asphalt, leaving long streaks of water behind, the windshield wipers squeaking steadily against the glass. Mason drove out of the city center, past several blocks before turning into a small parking lot in front of a building with a faintly glowing sign, City Children's Hospital. Ethan froze for a moment, his heart pounding, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the steering wheel. Mason parked, stepped out, still holding the thermal container close to his chest. He walked straight toward the staff entrance, greeting a nurse who was waiting. The nurse took the container, nodded solemnly, and disappeared through a door marked Pediatric Oncology. Ethan sat still, watching through the rain-specked glass, his chest suddenly feeling heavier than before. He quickly opened his laptop, accessing the company's internal database. Mason Grant's name popped up, along with his detailed personnel record. Ethan's eyes stopped at the family section. Ellie Grant, 9 years old, adopted daughter. Status, undergoing treatment for leukemia. He swallowed hard, his fingers pausing over the keyboard. A strange feeling settled over him. This was no longer just a business investigation. This was about someone's life. Switching to the browser, Ethan searched for Ellie Grant. Within minutes, he found a post on a support forum for families of children with cancer. The words on the screen made him go still. Ellie used to love spaghetti, especially the old Gusto Fresco sauce. But ever since they changed the recipe, she hasn't been able to eat it. Just smelling it makes her sick. I just want her to smile one more time while eating her favorite dish before it's too late. Posted by Dad in Apron. Ethan leaned back in his seat, staring at the glowing words as if hypnotized. He exhaled a long, quiet breath, murmuring under his breath, "So you're not hiding for yourself, Mason. You're fighting to give your daughter one last smile." Outside, Mason left the hospital, his steps heavy, shoulders slumped under the dim lights. Ethan watched him, a flicker of respect glinting in his eyes. Mason, who once seemed like a threat to the brand, now stood before him as a father desperately clinging to a fragile hope. And that made Ethan even more certain. If Mason is doing this alone, he might already be achieving what this entire system couldn't. I need to know the recipe he's working on. The rain grew heavier, drumming steadily on the car roof. Ethan tilted his head, staring at the hospital entrance, his voice low and steady in the darkness. If there's anything worth fighting for, it's the smile of a child. He wrote one final line in his notebook that night. "Tomorrow, I won't just observe. I'll start digging deeper. Mason Grant is no longer just a chef. He's a father fighting against my own system." The night rain poured heavily, pounding on the car roof in relentless rhythms, streetlights reflecting off the slick pavement in blurred streaks of dull yellow. Ethan stood beside his gray rental car, hood pulled low, his shoulders soaked through, but he didn't care. His eyes were locked on the hospital door, waiting. And then Mason appeared. He stepped out of the side entrance, his shoulders heavy, still clutching the now empty thermal container, his shoes splashing softly through puddles in the quiet dark. Ethan took a deep breath, stepped out from the shadows, and walked straight into the rain-slicked path. "Mason Grant," he called, his voice low but firm enough to cut through the sound of the rain. Mason froze, his body tensing like a pulled wire. His hand tightened around the container, his wary eyes narrowing sharply at Ethan. "Who are you?" Ethan pulled down his hood, revealing his face. Under the dim light, rainwater streamed down his cheeks, but his eyes gleamed, cold and resolute. "I know everything, Mason. About the nights you stayed in the kitchen, the experiments, even the late-night deliveries here." Mason instinctively stepped back, his eyes flashing with caution. "You came to threaten me or to report me to them?" His voice was hoarse, worn with exhaustion, but edged with defiance. Ethan shook his head slowly. "No, I'm not here to stop you. I'm here because I need to understand." He stepped closer, both of them standing still under the pounding rain, neither moving away. "What are you doing, Mason? Why are you fighting against the entire system alone?" Mason stayed silent, his jaw clenched, dark eyes guarded. Ethan met his stare, lowering his voice, steady and sure. "Because of Ellie, isn't it?" The name cut through Mason's defenses like a blade. His eyes flickered, his grip on the container loosening. He turned his face away, his voice cracking. "You don't understand." "Then let me understand," Ethan said, his tone unwavering. There was a long pause, the sound of rain filling the heavy silence between them. Finally, Mason exhaled, the tension in his shoulders falling as if releasing all resistance. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small glass jar, the label scribbled in shaky handwriting. "Ellie's safe." "She can't eat the new sauce they use now," Mason said, his voice low, almost like a confession. "Just the smell makes her sick. She used to love the pasta here. She used to laugh when she ate it. Now she's afraid to even look at it. His words faltered, his eyes fixed on the jar in his hands, his voice breaking as if crushed by the weight of his own helplessness. "I just want her to smile one more time before it's too late." Ethan stood still, looking at Mason as if seeing an entirely different man. Not an obsessive chef, not a disgruntled employee, but a desperate father clinging to his last hope. Mason held the jar out toward Ethan, his eyes lowered. "This is the old recipe. I've been trying to bring it back piece by piece, testing every temperature, every gram of every ingredient. I know I broke the rules, but I don't care anymore. I just want to keep Ellie's smile one last time." Ethan took the jar, his hand tightening slightly around the cool glass. He twisted the lid open, and instantly the rich aroma filled the air, carrying memories that crashed into him, memories of the early days when he stirred every pot himself, when a customer once cried because the taste reminded them of home. Closing his eyes briefly, Ethan inhaled deeply, then opened them, meeting Mason's gaze. There was no judgment in his eyes now, only determination. "I understand," he said slowly. "And you won't have to do this alone anymore." Mason looked up, doubt flickering in his eyes. But under the pounding rain, Ethan had already made his decision, a decision to change the entire system, starting with the smile of a little girl. The large conference room of Gusto Fresco buzzed softly as the executives took their seats. Bright white lights reflected off the polished wooden table, casting sharp glints across stern, experienced faces that seemed distant and detached. Behind them, the glowing Gusto Fresco logo loomed on the wall, a bitter reminder of the family and quality values they once proudly claimed to uphold. Ethan Ward entered, not in his usual tailored suit, but in a simple shirt carrying only a small glass jar. He said nothing at first. Instead, he placed the jar in the center of the table, gently but firmly. Under the light, the thick, deep red sauce inside gleamed, smooth and vibrant. Every pair of eyes turned toward it, puzzled. The financial director frowned slightly. "And this is... what exactly?" Ethan straightened, his gaze sweeping across the room, his voice dropping, sharp and cutting like a blade. "This is what we used to serve our customers, the very thing that put Gusto Fresco on the culinary map." He paused, his eyes hardening. "And this is what we betrayed when we decided to change the recipe just to cut costs." The marketing director shrugged, his tone pragmatic. Ethan, we've been over this. The new formula cuts production costs by 20% and extends shelf life. It makes financial sense. Ethan let out a short, cold laugh. Financial sense? What's more reasonable than a child vomiting at the smell of a dish that once made her smile? Do you even know how many loyal customers we've lost? How many one-star reviews are flooding social media right now? His hand slammed onto the table, his voice rising, strong and unwavering. We didn't just lose flavor, we lost our customers' trust. Silence fell across the room for a moment. One executive tried to argue. But the product still meets food safety standards. There are no legal violations. Ethan cut him off, his tone firm and unrelenting. Is legality the only standard we live by now? Let me ask you this. Ellie Grant, the daughter of one of our employees who used to love this sauce, now has to stay away from it because the X52 preservative triggers reactions in children with medical conditions. What will we say when customers start asking us the same question? No one answered. Ethan gestured to the jar, his voice lowering but carrying weight. This is what we used to serve. Original, safe, and made with ingredients families trusted. We don't need a new formula. We need to remember why we started cooking in the first place. His gaze moved from face to face, lingering long enough to make several look away. We chose money over people, but customers don't eat financial reports. They eat trust. And when that's gone, Gusto Fresco will be nothing more than an empty name. The room stayed silent. The older executive at the head of the table, a man who had worked with Ethan since the very beginning, sighed, his hands clasped in front of him. He looked at the jar, then straight at Ethan, his eyes thoughtful. What do you want, Ethan? Ethan answered without hesitation. Stop producing the new formula. Restore the original recipe across all locations, starting with branch 17. And I want Mason Grant, the only person patient enough to bring this flavor back, to lead the quality reform. The financial director protested. You realize that will raise costs and cut profits for at least 2 quarters? Ethan met his gaze head on, his voice resolute. I don't care about profits if the price is betraying our customers. If you want this brand to survive, you'll do the right thing. The tension in the room felt like a drawn bowstring. A few quick glances were exchanged before the older executive gave a slow nod. We'll take a vote. Minutes later, the decision passed almost unanimously. The jar of deep red sauce sat quietly in the center of the table, like a silent reminder that a revolution had just begun. Ethan exhaled, his hand resting lightly on the cool glass, his eyes more determined than ever. He whispered, just loud enough for himself, "We're bringing that smile back." The warm afternoon sunlight poured through the wide glass windows of Gusto Fresco Branch 17, casting a golden glow over polished wooden tables and a kitchen now organized to perfection. The atmosphere inside was completely different from before. No more lazy clinking of cutlery, no more dull, lifeless stares. Instead, cheerful conversations filled the air, blending with the rich aroma of ripe tomatoes and fresh basil wafting through the room. For the first time in months, Branch 17 felt alive again. At the open kitchen, Mason Grant stood among a group of young chefs. He was no longer the cold, rigid figure of the past, but calm and composed, quietly observing, nodding in encouragement from time to time. Whiteboards lined the walls, covered with new recipe experiments, and nearby a glass shelf displayed labeled jars of sample sauces. A young chef carefully measured sauce temperature with a thermometer. Another adjusted salt ratios. They all worked with intense focus, but their eyes shone with excitement rather than the fear and pressure that once filled this place. At a table by the window, Ellie sat quietly. She wore a simple dress, a hospital wristband still around her thin wrist, her bald head smooth under the sunlight, but her bright eyes sparkled with life. In front of her sat a steaming plate of spaghetti, perfectly coiled noodles coated in a deep, glossy red sauce, the same kind of dish that once made Gusto Fresco famous. Ellie hesitated for a moment, then gently twirled a forkful of pasta and took a bite. The moment the noodles touched her tongue, her eyes lit up. She chewed slowly, then suddenly burst into laughter, a pure, clear sound filling the room as dimples appeared on her cheeks. A streak of sauce clung to the corner of her mouth, but she didn't care, turning to look at Mason standing a few steps away, her smile radiant. Mason stood frozen, his hands at his sides, his eyes shimmering. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to smile. It wasn't a smile of victory, but one of relief, like a man finally lifting a heavy stone from his chest. Ethan watched quietly from near the kitchen entrance. The sunlight fell across his face, highlighting the depth in his gaze. His arms crossed loosely over his chest. He said nothing, only nodded slightly when Mason looked up and met his eyes. The two men exchanged a subtle nod, not as a superior and his employee, but as two people who understood exactly what they were fighting for. A server approached Ethan, whispering, "Today's menu is getting rave reviews, Mr. Ward. We're fully booked for the entire week." Ethan smiled faintly, replying in a low, steady tone, "Make sure it stays that way. Never forget why we started." He glanced at Ellie once more. The girl was laughing louder now, sauce smeared across her chin, while Mason stepped over to gently wipe it away with a napkin, his eyes full of love. That laughter, simple, pure, untouched by anything else, was proof that everything they had done was worth it. Ethan drew a deep breath, looking around at the lively kitchen where chefs worked like true artists. He whispered softly, only for himself, "We brought this dish back to its soul. And more importantly, we kept a smile alive that the world had no right to take away." Outside, the afternoon sun stretched across the bustling street. The Gusto Fresco sign glimmered in the light, standing as a promise that this was more than just a restaurant. It was a place where precious memories were preserved. A brand is not built on numbers, but on how it touches people's hearts. And sometimes, the strongest way to keep trust isn't through strategy or profit. It's simply a plate of pasta made with genuine sincerity. If you believe that keeping the soul of a dish means keeping the trust of an entire generation of customers, hit like to support true values, subscribe so you won't miss other inspiring stories, and comment below with the words, "Keep the soul," so we can remind each other, never forget why we started.